She took a piece of foam and laid a curse on Caroline. As long as this foam remained soaked in water, may tears never dry from your eyes, she said as she threw it into a very deep well. The pain was too much for her fragile heart to carry, and so she passed on few days later. Caroline kept the secret for a long time. Few months later, her father had a heart attack and died. Unaware of his father's other family, Caroline was sent out of her father's house as she was just a girl. Her uncles and step-family took over all the properties and left her on the streets. None of her friends' family was willing to help her as they suspected that she had a hand in Grace's death and did not want their children to associate with her. At just 16, Caroline started living in the street. She would cry day and night, but no help ever came to her. Everyone resented her. Her life became a nightmare. No one was willing to employ her. She was sent out of school over unpaid school fees. Caroline had no choice than to take the job of a garbage collector. She worked for several hours, but got penny which was barely enough for her to feed. This continued for a long time. She was constantly humiliated by her creditors over unpaid debt. Her life became a nightmare. She had no home to stay. She was constantly moving from one uncompleted building to the other. One day, an incident that changed her life forever occurred. When she was sleeping in one of the abandoned buildings, some group of scary men came and had their way with her, leaving her for dead. Caroline called for help, but no one came to her rescue. She went to the authorities the next morning, but they paid no attention to her. She went to the hospital, but they refused to attend to her because she had no money. Caroline's depression intensified. She attempted taking her own life, but she was saved by a man named Aminu. Aminu took her to the hospital where she was immediately treated. Aminu was a rich man who visited the town yearly. He took care of Caroline and brought her to the apartment he was staying. Caroline was so happy. At last, help had come. She thanked Aminu and told him that she was willing to do anything to pay back the favor. Aminu told her that he had a job for her in the city, which they would go to in a couple of days. Caroline was very happy and she agreed. 2 days later, they traveled together to the city. When they got there, Aminu took her to a place that looked like a beautiful mansion from the outside and a motel on the inside. He told Caroline that that was the place she would be working. After a while, a funny-looking woman came. Aminu and her exchanged pleasantries. Her name was Madame Vero. Madame Vero had this funny and fearful look. She asked Caroline for her name and she told her. "Stand up and turn around," she said to Caroline. Caroline did as instructed. "She's truly a beautiful girl," as she said. "Hope she's willing to do the job because I don't take any rubbish," Madame Vero said. Aminu assured her that she was more than capable. Madame Vero brought out some bundles of cash and gave it to him. Caroline was a bit confused because she had not yet started working. The money was huge. She knew it wasn't possible for it to be the agency fee, but she had no answer to her unspoken question. Few minutes later, Aminu hugged Madame Vero and bid Caroline goodbye after instructing her to do whatever Madame Vero said. Madame Vero's boys took her to a room in the house. Caroline was happy that the job came with an accommodation. She settled in, took her bath as recommended by Madame Vero, after which she took a quick nap. Later that evening, Madame Vero came into the room and told her that she would start working that evening. Caroline asked her what the job was about, but Madame Vero smiled at her and told her that she would find out soon. Few minutes later, an older man with pot's belly came into the room smiling in a disgusting manner. Caroline was uncomfortable and asked him to leave. She shouted for help but only heard echoes of laughter. The old man overpowered her and had his way. When Madame Vero came, Caroline ran to her and explained the situation. But in her presence, the man gave some money to Madame Vero. It was this moment Caroline knew she had been sold into prostitution. What do you think would happen to Caroline? Do you think she would be able to set herself free and live a good normal life again? Leave a comment below and don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, let's continue. Caroline cried her eyes out just when she thought her life was getting better. She was to continue her suffering as an enslaved prostitute. She begged Madame Vero to let her go, but it was to no avail. Caroline tried to escape several times, but she was caught and dealt with severely. She had no choice than to accept her fate. She worked for Madame Vero for years. No day passed that she did not shed tears. She was introduced to hard drugs, but the pain never went away. Most of the men that came to the brothel abused her physically, treated her like trash. In all this, Madame Vero never gave her a penny. One day, Caroline became very sick. When she was almost at the verge of dying, Madame Vero took her to the hospital where she received the greatest shock of her life. She had been infected with HIV and had progressed into AIDS. Caroline cried and screamed. Her agony doubled, but she had no one to turn to. Madame Vero threw her out of the brothel and asked her never to show her face again. All of them mocked her and treated her disgustingly. Caroline swore to take revenge on Madame Vero and her cohorts. She went to the police to report, but Madame Vero was very influential. The policemen chased her away and accused her of defaming Madame Vero's name. In desperation, she went to see a very powerful voodoo man. Caroline begged him to help her eliminate Madame Vero, and the voodoo man agreed. I'll do as you said, my child, but before I do so, look into your conscience and be sure that you've never harmed or ruined anybody's life before. Caroline, without much thinking, assured him that her hands were clean. Before they could continue, the voodoo man asked her who Grace was. She's the reason for your sorrowful life. Her grandmother cursed you many years ago because of what you did to her. It was that time Caroline's life flashed before her eyes. It turned out that many years ago, Caroline was a very beautiful girl and the daughter of a rich businessman in the community. Her father adored her so much because she was the only daughter of the family. Caroline, on the other hand, was very proud and arrogant. She attended the best school in the community. All her classmates envied her and wished they had her life. She was nicknamed the Queen of the class. She had all her classmates at her beck and call, willing to do whatever she asked for. One day, a young girl named Grace got an admission to the school through the yearly scholarship scheme, which was sponsored by the rich parents of the students. Grace was a very quiet and peaceful girl. She was very intelligent and beautiful, but she was from a very poor home. She grew up with her grandmother, who sold food items in the community market. From the very first day Caroline saw Grace, she hated her because her crush complimented her in the class. Ever since that day, Caroline bullied Grace. Grace reported her to the school authorities, but nothing was done about it because Caroline's father was the major sponsor of the school. Caroline, on realizing that nothing could be done to her because of her father's influence, began to abuse Grace. Grace would plead, but Caroline felt no pity. She gave Grace multiple bruises on her body. This encounter drove poor Grace into depression. One day, she fell ill and was rushed to the hospital by her grandmother. The doctor told them that the sickness was due to the infection on her wounds. Her grandmother was shocked when she saw the wounds. Heartbroken, she went to Caroline's house to teach her a lesson. But some officers stopped her and warned her never to show her face in the house again. Her grandmother was disappointed. She went to the school authority and they accused her of lying against Caroline. She realized that Caroline's father's influence would stand in the way of justice, and so she decided to withdraw Grace from the school. This whole experience shattered Grace and her dream of getting a better life, but she decided not to give up. After spending few days at the hospital, she told her grandmother that she was not going to give up her scholarship. I believe that now that she have confronted her family and the school, the bullying will stop. Please, Mama, I can't forfeit this scholarship. I have to continue so that I can also be able to further my education in the university, Grace said to her grandmother. But she refused, stating that she would rather have her attend a public school in good health than to be abused by Caroline and her cohorts. The next day, when her grandmother had gone to the market, Grace dressed up and secretly went to school. She knew that her grandmother was never going to agree, and so she decided to do it in secret. When Caroline saw her, she continued with her bullying, but Grace defended herself, and it led to a fight. Grace gave Caroline a beating of her life, which made everyone in the class to lose their respect for the mighty Caroline. But this experience brew more anger and hatred in her heart. Caroline thought of ways to redeem herself and earn back the respect from her friends who started avoiding her. She paid some gangster to kidnap Grace on her way from school and take naked pictures of her, which she anonymously posted on her school group chat. Grace was unaware of the picture. The only thing she remembered was being hit by a hard object on her head, after which she passed out. The boys carried out their evil works, took naked pictures of her, dressed her back and placed her by the roadside, where she was helped by some good Samaritans who thought she had fainted. When Grace got home, she knew something bad had happened to her. Her body had changed, but she was afraid to speak about it. The next day, Grace went back to school just to find everyone staring at her in a strange way. The principal called her to her office and showed her the pictures, asking her to explain herself. Grace was heartbroken on seeing her naked pictures. She couldn't remember anything. In shock, she grabbed her bag and started running home. Her sight was blurred from the tears she was crying. She forgot to look before she crossed the road and was unfortunately hit by a speeding car. She was immediately rushed to the hospital where she died. When grandmother heard about what had happened, she passed out and was rushed to the hospital where Grace's body was lying lifeless. The news of the incident quickly spread round. Caroline was terrified. The fear of being caught crept through her skin. Although there were suspicions, but no one was certain that she was responsible for what happened. An investigation was launched by the police, but the school authorities told them that she ran away from school after she discovered that her naked pictures had circulated. Because the incident did not occur in the school premises, they recorded it as an accident. When her grandmother woke up, she went to see Grace. It was the most heartbreaking moment of her life. People narrated what happened to her, and without a doubt, she knew it was Caroline. Grandma wept, but it couldn't bring back poor Grace. Grace was buried later that day. The incident changed her grandmother's life. She went to Caroline's house, but she was thrown out and threatened to be arrested. Grandmother knew justice would never be served, and so she took a piece of foam and laid a curse on Caroline. As long as this foam remained soaked in water, may tears never dry from your eyes, Caroline, she said as she threw it into a very deep well. The pain was too much for her fragile heart to carry, and so she passed on few days later. Caroline, on hearing these words from the voodoo man, knew she was in deep trouble. She begged the voodoo man to help her find the well, but he was unable to. Your destiny had been sealed. Not even I can break the curse. Try and live a clean life from now on, and forgive all who wronged you. Maybe her spirit will someday set you free, the voodoo man said to Caroline. Over my dead body, I know I wronged Grace, but I will never forgive Madame Vero and her accomplice. I deserve justice for what they did to me. If you cannot help me, I'll go and find help somewhere else, Caroline said to the voodoo man. He laughed and shook his head, for he knew she was not remorseful for what she did. Caroline, in so much disappointment, left the shrine to look for help from someone who can help her take revenge on Madame Vero. She visited another voodoo house and narrated all that Madame Vero did to her. She was given a charm to use on Madame Vero in order for her to become an imbecile. But unknown to Caroline, Madame Vero was a river child whom had been fortified from birth. Caroline did as instructed, but unfortunately for her, the charms backfired and she ran mad. She began to roam around the city till she was hit by a car, which led to her death. This is the end of this story. What did you learn from today's story? Do you think Caroline deserved what she went through? Was grandmother wrong for laying a curse on her? Leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Thank you for listening to today's story. Please do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. We love and appreciate you. See you in our next story.